Welcome to International Forum. Today our program is about the Middle East. It has been 3 years since the United States-led invasion into Iraq toppled Saddam Hussein's government. After failed attempts to find weapons of mass destruction, which we now know there were none, the building democracy in Iraq and spreading democracy in the Middle East became the signature foreign policy objectives of the Bush administration. What are our successes and failures so far? And what are some of the new developments in the Middle East? How has the region changed? What are some of the foreign policy challenges facing the United States? Are some of the topics that I hope to cover in today's discussion. Please join me to welcome, as our special guest, the Honorable Daniel Kurtzer for this discussion. Dr. Kurtzer is the S. Daniel Abraham Visiting Professor in Middle Eastern Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And most recently, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Israel from 2001 to 2005. And before that, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt for 4 years. He is an expert on Middle East and ongoing efforts toward peace, and he has contributed significantly to the ongoing peace efforts between Israelis and Palestinians, and played an integral role, important role in building relations between the United States, Egypt, and Israel. The Honorable Kurtzer had received the President's Distinguished Service Award, among other awards. Welcome, Ambassador Kurtzer.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much to take time out of your busy schedule to join us. Since you were so recently Ambassador to Israel, I thought I'd start by asking you this question, peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. What are the prospects for peace now that we've had 2 major events happen within a period of weeks? First, we had this Hamas victory. I think first we had Ariel Sharon, who was a man of peace in the end, who started to withdraw and giving peace a real chance, but he got sick with stroke. And then you had the Hamas victory. Hamas, as we know, does not recognize the existence of Israel. So where do things stand now?
Well, I would like to be more optimistic, but I think I can't be right now, despite the fact that there's a pressing need for peace, for stability, for political economic development in the Palestinian and Israeli sectors. We are probably further away from the realization of peace than we have been for some time. Starting in the year 2000, of course, we had the Palestinian uprising, the Intifada. It really exacted an enormous price on both societies. Thousands of people were killed. The damage to Palestinian infrastructure and to the ability of Palestinians to govern themselves, really untold amounts of damage. And a series of events led, I think, inexorably to the victory of Hamas in the recent elections. The failure of the Palestinian Authority to govern, the corruption that's rampant within Palestinian society, and the inability of the Palestinians to deliver anything on the peace agenda for the Palestinian people. So I think we have a real challenge ahead of us, and that is, at least in the period ahead, what I call peace management. How do you at least calm the situation down and try to build some bridges of understanding in order to get back to a point where you can actually negotiate some peace agreements?
What, an integral part of the peace process is this Quartet of Peace, Quartet for Peace. It consists of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations. This group set conditions for negotiating with Hamas, which are, these conditions are to recognize Israel and to forsake violence and to accept the previously agreed upon peace negotiations. What do you think of this set of conditions? Are they realistic?
Well, I think it's reasonable in any intergovernmental negotiation for both sides to be able to rely upon the other side to accept one's right to exist. I think the quartet's asking the Hamas-led Palestinian Authority to accept Israel's right to exist is a logical extension of any kind of a peace process. It's also logical when a government takes power that it would reaffirm previous agreements into which its predecessors had entered. So again, I think it was logical for the quartet to ask the Hamas-led government to do that. What I think the quartet was trying to do was a relatively nuanced set of principles. In other words, it says to Hamas, look, you're the new guys in town. You just were elected. Do the minimum necessary to enter into this process, and then you can try to carry out your own policies. But if you're not even prepared to do the minimum, it will be very hard for Israel and for the international community to relate to you and to deal with you.
But that is the view of the West. The Arab view is that if Hamas is going to renounce violence, then Israel should too.
Well, interestingly, countries like Egypt and Jordan have also made demands on Hamas to accept the quartet's conditions. In fact, these conditions were incorporated in a statement by the UN Security Council, which means that they now represent a consensus of the international community. Clearly, I think the Arab world would like to see Israel forego the counter-violence, the counter-terrorism that it engages in. And to the extent that Hamas will continue the ceasefire or the so-called tahadiyah, which is a kind of calm period that had characterized the situation in the last year, then I think Israel would reciprocate. But as you know, this has been a false calm. There's been a tremendous number of terrorist incidents and violent incidents, and both sides will have to try much harder in order to restore the calm that had existed some months ago.
So what, in your view, are the chances, realistically, that the two sides, the Hamas and the Israelis, will come together, sit at the same table and talk?
I think in the immediate term there are no realistic possibilities of that happening. Hamas feels very self-confident as a result of its electoral victory that it can carry out its program with the support of the Palestinian people, and that program is a very hard-line program. You're about to have an Israeli election at the end of March 28th, and the next government that emerges in Israel, likely a coalition that's headed by the current acting Prime Minister, Mr. Ehud Olmert, will also feel self-confident in carrying out a policy that's supported by the Israeli people. And unfortunately, there are few points at which the policies of the two sides touch right now. And that's why I think rather than anticipate a period of negotiation, what we probably should be looking for is a period of trying to get back to calm, to restore a ceasefire, to separate the two communities and allow them to live without each other a little bit, maybe interpose some conditions and even some international forces if necessary in order to keep the two sides apart, and then see if we can't over time break down some of the barriers to actual negotiations.
If you were the advisor to the Israeli government, what would you tell them specifically, or recommend to them specifically to do and to not do?
Well, I think it's always been important in our discussions with Israel to remind Israel not to engage in settlement activity. The area of the West Bank is still a subject of the actual negotiating process, and it would be contrary to, I think, the good intentions that Israel wants to show for it to build settlements or to allow a massive influx of new population into the West Bank. So I think the first thing would be to advise Israel to slow down and stop settlement activity. I think the second thing, of course, is to moderate as much as possible its response to Palestinian violence. What I mean by that is every state has a right to defend itself, and the United States has been very clear in saying to Israel that it has the right to respond to terrorism, but it needs to be careful to respond to the sources of the terrorism and not to expand the response that might include civilian population.
Would you go as far as to recommend Israel to withdraw from the West Bank? altogether, as Ariel Sharon wanted to do and would have done had he not become sick?
Well, very interestingly, of the three major parties contesting the Israeli election, Mr. Olmert's party, the Kadima party, is actually now on record in favor of a major withdrawal from the West Bank.
Which reflects public opinion.
Which reflects public opinion, which would continue at least the spirit of what Mr. Sharon had initiated last year. And Mr. Olmert has not been shy, even during an election campaign, to tell the Israeli people what to expect. He says that it's not healthy for Israel to continue to occupy these vast tracts of Palestinian territory, that by retaining a relatively small amount of land, which includes a large number of Israeli citizens, Israel could secure its national purposes. And so I don't think the United States needs to lecture to Mr. Olmert. I think he's heading in that direction, and it's something that we could very much support.
Well, if you were an advisor to the American government, what would you recommend for the government to do and not do?
Yeah, I've been there and I've done that.
Yes, yes.
I think what's important now for the United States is to remain engaged in what I would call a realistic attempt to bring the parties together. I've been quite
What's
disappointed.
realistic?
Well, I've been quite disappointed over the years that even though we've had individuals who have been named special envoy or special coordinator, we really haven't had as much impact on events on the ground as we might have had. Our envoys tend to stay in Washington rather than travel. They tend to come to the region and lecture rather than listen. I think we have a great deal to learn about the positions of the parties if we're prepared to spend time and engage with them. One of the advantages of having ambassadors and embassies is that you have a full-time presence on the ground. But I think our envoys from Washington also need to spend much more time trying to understand what's really motivating the two sides. And I think with a greater degree of American involvement, we would stand a chance in helping the parties restore calm and paving the way to get back to negotiations.
But what should we aim for?
Well, in the short term, it's keeping calm. It's maintaining a ceasefire. I think if there is another outbreak of major violence, things will only get worse, both humanitarian situation as well as the prospects for peace. So the first objective of the United States has to be an extension of the ceasefire and a real monitoring capability to ensure that it holds. I think second, we need to exercise a little bit more influence on the two sides to carry out their obligations under the so-called roadmap for peace. With Israel, that means no unilateral actions such as settlement construction. It means opening up more mobility for Palestinians. For Palestinians, it means better governance, uprooting corruption, and providing public services to Palestinian people that they deserve.
Well, should we sit down with Hamas and talk with them? Because so far we say we will not talk with you unless you renounce violence and recognize Israel.
Yeah, I think the conditions that the quartet, the international community, have laid down are the right ones, and so I would not recommend opening up a different channel of dialogue with Hamas. There are, in fact, a number of people on the international scene who already talked to Hamas, some ex-officials and some others, and I think we have a relatively fair degree of understanding of what Hamas is looking for. But Hamas has to make decisions now. The United States is not a party to this conflict. Hamas is a party to the conflict, and I think they ought to be put on the spot to make the right decisions before their extended recognition and formal dialogue.
The Egyptians seem to be rather optimistic about the Hamas changing their positions. They think that with the responsibility of governance coming upon them, that they will develop, they will evolve, and that would be all for the better.
Well, I hope the Egyptians are right. I'm certainly rooting for them, and I know that President Mubarak and his negotiating chiefs, including his intelligence chief, General Suleiman, are intent upon influencing Hamas in that direction. And I hope that optimism turns to reality. You know, Hamas can maintain its own views about peace and about the construction of Palestinian society, but it can't expect the recognition or respect of the international community if it will not even accept the right to exist of its partner, Israel. And so I think if the Egyptians are successful, we can we can make some progress, and I do hope the Egyptians are able to do that.
Let's turn our discussion to Iran. The past 3 years have seen Iran's influence in the region grow. Iran seems to be the only winner, or the winner, in the turmoil and bloodshed in the last 3 years. Do you agree with that? And why is that the case?
You know, I often try to put myself into the shoes of the party that I'm studying, and I think if I were an Iranian right now, I wouldn't consider myself to have been a big victor or to have gained a great deal from events of the past few years. If I look at my strategic situation, I now am a country that's surrounded by American forces. I have American forces in Iraq, I have American forces in Afghanistan and Central Asia, American allied forces in the Gulf and Pakistan and the subcontinent. And from a geostrategic standpoint, as an Iranian, I would be very, very concerned about the expansion and extension of American power in the region, number one. Number two, while there are some immediate gains that may be on the horizon with respect to the growing influence of Shiism in Iraq, we know from history that there have been very significant differences between the Shia movement in Iraq and the Shia hierarchy in Iran. And so I think it would be too simplistic to say that simply because these are co-religionists that somehow I, as an Iranian, would feel happy about their ascendancy. I think there are still some very major problems to be overcome. And I think the third factor that I would be looking at as an Iranian is my domestic situation. Sure, a hardline president was elected a year ago and has certainly been, has not been bashful about putting his finger in the eye of the international community. But my domestic situation is quite problematic. Very unhappy middle class, very unhappy youth, the growth of underground activities that are pro-Western, pro-American. And I think there would be great concern in Iran about the direction that this would take. So I think the Iranians are probably much more nervous now than satisfied with the situation. And that may account for some of the bluster that they've used in recent weeks in talking about their strategic situation.
Yeah, I guess such anxieties must be a big reason behind their drive to for their nuclear program.
Oh, sure.
Now, this nuclear Iran, what options do we have to sort of get a handle on the situation?
Well, the international community has been of one mind for the past few years to try to turn back the Iranian program peacefully through diplomacy. And it's really been very interesting to watch. People tend to have a fairly skeptical view of what diplomacy can accomplish, but you've seen over these past couple of years the coming together of the international community in a very linear fashion. The Iranians are finding less and less space to maneuver diplomatically on this issue. In fact, in the next weeks or months, the Security Council is likely to take up the issue of the Iranian nuclear program. And this is an outcome that the Iranians have been fighting doggedly against. They have not wanted to be taken to the Security Council. So the first methodology to pursue is diplomacy, and I think all
and
parties...
you're saying we have made progress there.
Oh, we have, definitely. The United States has worked very closely with all parties at the International Atomic Energy Agency. We've allowed Britain, France, and Germany to act as a kind of advanced party in the diplomacy, but the coordination has been very close. Israel has been on board, and we've tried even to bring some of Iran's friends like China to a point where today even the Chinese did not object to bringing the issue to the Security Council. So diplomacy still has some room to play itself out.
Well, there's some, among certain circles in the United States, there's been talk about a military solution. Do you see that?
Well, those circles include the Vice President of the United States, who speaks very openly about keeping that option on the table. Look, from the perspective of having a strong diplomacy, you don't want to ever exclude options other than negotiations. And so I think it's been a reasonable part of our diplomatic effectiveness to be able to say that we will retain an option to deal with this program other than through diplomacy, in other words, through military means. but it is certainly not a preferred way to do so. The Iranians have spent many years putting this program underground in hardened places, dispersing it, probably parts of the program in cities, which would involve large civilian casualties in a case of an attack. And these are hard targets to hit. So a military option is not a preferred option, but I think it's a responsible part of a government's quiver to keep that arrow at the ready.
A couple of questions about Iraq. Do you believe that a civil war is inevitable?
Well, I don't know what you want to call what's currently happening. I know it's called an insurgency. Sectarian insurgency.
Fighting between the Shiites and Sunnis. And
it's pretty close to a civil war in most people's books. And I think the only difference would be whether or not total chaos replaced what amounts to now a certain amount of governing function. And I think there's no reason to be optimistic that we can avoid that as long as we don't find a way to deal more effectively with the insurgency.
What about United States disengagement from Iraq? How do we get out of this mess?
Well, I think we're just going to have to bite the bullet at some point. It hurts to say that because we would want to leave behind a very well-functioning government. We would want to see some success in the offing for such a government, but I'm not sure that we have that responsibility over time.
You use the words "at some point." I'm going to try to get closer to what do you mean? Say this year, next year, in 3 years, or what?
Well, I don't see any reason why we're not setting benchmarks starting today, and whatever the reasonable timeframes are, perhaps in 6 months to be able to withdraw X number of troops in response to the training of Y number of Iraqi forces. In a year to withdraw a further number of troops in response to the extension of the Iraqi government's reach into different provinces. In other words, it's not for me right now to lay down the benchmarks, but I don't understand why we're not putting those benchmarks out in public for both the United States to see as well as for the Iraqi people to see that this is not an open-ended commitment to maintain American forces there. And over a period of perhaps 2 years or 3 years, we should be able to withdraw virtually all of our troops, see some of them replaced by an international consortium that would help the Iraqi forces begin to carry out their responsibilities. But at some point, the Iraqis are going to have to stand on their own feet, and we should be explaining clearly when that would happen. And I would say 2 to 3 years at a maximum to draw down to very small number of American forces.
Give us your view on the Middle East as a whole there. America tried to spread democracy there. What do you see? I mean, what have we achieved?
I've spent most of my career, both as an academic and also as a government practitioner, either in or working on the Middle East. And one of the great disappointments is that the Middle East seems to defy most of the norms of the international community. It is a region where democratization has not taken root, despite the strong efforts of this administration to propagate democratic norms. We have had free and fair elections in the Middle East, but we don't have a democratic culture at all.
In fact, the Islamist parties or groups have won in elections. In Egypt, you have the Muslim Brotherhood. In the Palestine, you have the Hamas victory.
Lebanon, you have Hezbollah.
Right.
I think this
in Iraq too.
This is a failure on our part to define democratization as a goal as opposed to elections. We've confused people into believing that if they run a free and fair election, they somehow are democratic. And that's not the case. We know it from our own culture. We see it in other democratic cultures around the world. Elections are a manifestation of democracy, but they're not necessarily the same thing as democracy. So I think we're all disappointed that the Middle East seems impervious to democratic change. I'm also quite concerned about the failure of economic development in the Middle East. You've seen for too long a Middle East that's been dependent only on oil and gas revenues, And very few countries have used the revenues, even the windfall profits that they're experiencing today, to build a longer-term future for their people. Very little trickle-down effect from oil profits, and very little what you'd call society-wide development. A few years ago, in fact, there was an interesting study done by the United Nations by Arabs themselves who recognized some very significant failures in their own society, a failure to provide freedom for the population, a failure to educate people, and a failure to empower women to participate actively in society. So even the Arabs themselves, I think, know their weaknesses, and it's about time that they got a hold of these issues and started working both on the economic and political sides.
What is the public mood in the region? Do you see sort of movement at the grassroots level that will bring about changes along those
There's
lines?
not much. Certainly the efforts by the United States and the G8 in the past couple of years to promote some democracy programs have elicited a little bit of interest. The elections themselves, even though they're not, as I said, more than a mechanism of democracy, have elicited interest on the part of the Arab street. But you don't see a mass movement now to demand change from governments. And you see governments that are very nervous about innovating and about initiating change because of the concerns that the only beneficiaries of change will be the radical Islamic organized groups. So I think it's a period of great nervousness on the part of the Arab street and on the part of Arab rulers, and therefore there's not a lot of ferment or movement right now.
Our time is just about up. I'd like you to look ahead into the next 10 years. How do you see the Middle East 10 years from now?
Well, I think there are three ways or three critical barometers to assess where we're going to be in 10 years. Number one, will we have made progress on the Arab-Israeli front? The Arab-Israeli conflict is not necessarily the cornerstone of everything that happens in the region, but if we're able to make some progress, then it will change everything in the region. In 10 years, I think we have a chance of being in a better position than we are now, if not through agreement, then through unilateral Israeli withdrawals that I think will take place in the next couple of years. Second barometer will be how efficiently and quickly we can disengage from Iraq. If, in fact, over the next 2 to 3 years, we have set reasonable benchmarks and we have then withdrawn our forces as a result of that, I think not only will we be out of that quagmire, but the Middle East will be better off for it as well. And the third is going to be the degree to which we can stop the Iranian nuclear program. This is not only an existential threat to the state of Israel, but there is no one in that region who will benefit from Iran's asserting that power, except for the Iranians. And certainly under their current government, that's a dangerous mixture.
Thank you, Ambassador Kurtzer.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for watching our program today. See you next time. This is Mei Chang for International Forum.